Sophie Johnson was just 16. She had a family who loved her, friends who cared for her, and dreams of what her future could be. But all of that was ripped away in a heartbreaking act that left the entire town in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend the horror of what had happened. And the man responsible, the one who tore her life apart, he wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone lurking in the shadows. He was a man everyone trusted. Deputy Mark Willis, a figure of authority, a man sworn to protect, was supposed to be the defender of the innocent. Instead, he became the predator. He raped Sophie, a girl whose only crime was trusting someone with a badge, someone who should have stood between her and danger. Weeks later, Sophie discovered she was pregnant. Fear gripped her. She was a child, carrying the child of a man who had violated her in the worst possible way. She couldn't tell anyone. How could she? How do you speak out when your abuser is the one who holds all the power? But the deputy's fear of being exposed grew with every day that passed. And in his desperation to protect his secret, he made a choice that would end everything. He killed her. In cold blood, he took Sophie's life, silencing her forever. This is the story of Sophie Johnson, raped, pregnant, and gruesomely murdered by the man who was supposed to protect her. It's a story of betrayal, a story of horror, and a story that will never be forgotten. In the small town of Maplewood, trust was a way of life. It was a place where people believed in their community, their neighbors, and the law. It was a town where families felt safe, where the lines between good and bad were clear. Or so everyone thought. But for one family, that sense of safety was about to be ripped apart by the very person who was meant to uphold it. Sophie Johnson was just 16, a girl like so many others, full of life, with plans for the future. She was growing up in a town that felt secure, surrounded by people she knew and trusted. Among them was Deputy Mark Willis, a man who wore a badge, who had a duty to protect the community. But what no one knew was that Deputy Willis would betray that trust in a way that would forever alter the lives of everyone in the town. This isn't a story about a distant criminal or a random act of violence. This is a story about a young girl who became the victim of someone who held power over her, someone who used that power not to safeguard her, but to control her. In the months that followed, Sophie would find herself trapped in a nightmare she could never have imagined. A nightmare that started with a terrible violation and ended with her losing her life. Sophie Johnson was just 16 years old, a high school junior. She was known for her warmth, her kindness, and her infectious energy. She had a smile that could light up a room, and her friends often said that she was the kind of person who made others feel better simply by being around. In her small town, Sophie was well liked by both teachers and classmates. She was involved in her school's volunteer programs and was always the first to raise her hand when someone needed help. Sophie wasn't just popular, she was also ambitious. From a young age, she had dreamed of becoming a nurse. She loved the idea of helping people, of being there for those who needed care, and her nurturing nature made that dream seem like the perfect fit. Her family often spoke about her plans to go to college, the excitement she felt when talking about her future, and how hard she worked in school to make those dreams come true. At home, Sophie was the youngest of 3 children, and her parents, John and Linda Johnson, were incredibly proud of her. They described her as the heart of the family, someone who brought joy into their lives every single day. Her mother would often say, Sophie's laughter was contagious. When she laughed, the whole house felt alive. Her father remembered the long talks they would have about her future, how she wanted to make a difference in the world by helping others. To her parents, she wasn't just their daughter, she was their friend, their confidant, and their source of happiness. Sophie's older siblings, a brother and a sister, adored her. They saw her as the little sister who was always curious, always asking questions, always eager to learn. Her brother, Michael, would often take her out for ice cream after school, and they'd spend hours talking about everything from schoolwork to her favorite music. Her sister, Emily, remembered Sophie as someone who always looked up to her, but in reality, it was Emily who admired Sophie's strength and determination. But Sophie wasn't just about school and family. She was also passionate about her hobbies. She loved animals and spent her weekends volunteering at a local animal shelter. Sophie had a soft spot for stray dogs and would often tell her parents how one day she'd open her own animal rescue center. She spent hours reading about animal care and was determined to make a difference in their lives, just as she wanted to make a difference in the lives of people she would one day care for as a nurse. Her future seemed bright. There were college brochures scattered on her desk, dreams of leaving her small town behind to attend nursing school in the city. Her family spoke often about the excitement Sophie had when she received her acceptance letters, about how proud they were to see her taking the first steps toward her future. But all of that was taken away. The dreams, the plans, the laughter that filled their home. It was all stolen from them. Sophie's family and friends never imagined that their loving, caring, and vibrant daughter, sister, and friend would become the victim of such a horrific act. The young girl with her whole life ahead of her, a girl who only wanted to help others, was gone. In small towns, law enforcement officers are often more than just public servants. They are neighbors, friends, even family to those they protect. In Maplewood, Deputy Mark Willis was one of those familiar faces. He had been a part of the community for years, and over time, he had built a reputation as a man who kept the peace. Parents felt reassured seeing him patrol the streets. Children would wave as he drove by. He was seen as someone who took his job seriously, who was always looking out for the people in the town. He wore his uniform with pride, and the badge on his chest stood for justice. But beneath that uniform, behind the smile he gave to the townspeople, there was something no one saw. A darkness that he kept hidden from the very people who trusted him the most. Deputy Mark Willis was not just an officer, he was a man of influence. He knew the families, he knew the routines, and he knew how to insert himself into their lives. He had an ability to make people feel comfortable around him. He was charismatic, often stopping by homes on his rounds to chat with parents and make small talk with the children. For many, it was a comforting presence. For Sophie Johnson's family, it was no different. They saw him as someone who was just doing his job, someone who cared about the safety of their neighborhood, someone who had their best interests at heart. But they didn't see the true intentions that lay beneath the surface. Mark Willis had been watching Sophie for some time. She was young, innocent, and full of life. To him, she represented something he could control, something he could take advantage of. And as a deputy, he had the perfect cover. He could come and go as he pleased. He could interact with families under the guise of keeping the community safe, and no one would think twice about it. He started small, friendly conversations here and there. He'd pass by Sophie's house while on duty, sometimes waving from his patrol car, sometimes stopping to chat with her parents. "Just checking in," he'd say, always with that calm, reassuring tone that made him seem like the perfect officer. Sophie's parents, John and Linda, appreciated his attention. They thought it was a sign of a good officer, someone who truly cared about their safety and well-being. He would ask about Sophie, about her school, her interests, subtly embedding himself deeper into their lives. It wasn't long before he started focusing more on Sophie herself. He'd find reasons to engage with her when her parents weren't around. Perhaps he'd see her walking home from school and offer her a ride, or maybe he'd stop by the house when he knew she was home alone. He was careful, never pushing too hard too soon. He needed her to trust him, to feel comfortable around him. And for Sophie, who had grown up believing that police officers were the people you turned to in times of need, there was no reason to be suspicious. To her, he was just Officer Willis, the friendly local cop who had always been kind to her and her family. What Sophie didn't realize was that Mark Willis was grooming her, manipulating her trust for his own gain. He used his position as an authority figure to blur the lines between right and wrong. Every conversation, every chance encounter was carefully calculated. He knew how to say the right things, how to present himself as someone she could depend on. He was patient, slowly chipping away at the boundaries that should have protected her. And with every interaction, he moved one step closer to his ultimate goal. Sophie's family had no idea what was happening. To them, he was still just the deputy, still the man who was always looking out for them. They trusted him completely. He had access to their home, their lives, and their daughter, and they never once questioned his intentions. After all, why would they? He had given them no reason to doubt him. He was always professional, always respectful. At least, that's how it seemed on the surface. But Mark Willis was far from the protector they believed him to be. He was manipulating their trust, using his role as a law enforcement officer to get closer to Sophie in ways that no one would suspect. And when the time was right, when he knew he had her trust, he made his move. One evening, when Sophie was home alone, he stopped by the house. At first, it was no different from any of his other visits. He was friendly, asking about her day, making small talk. But this time, there was something different in his demeanor. He wasn't just there to chat. He had planned this moment carefully, knowing that Sophie wouldn't expect anything, and that was when he revealed his true intentions. The knock at the door was nothing unusual. When Sophie opened it and saw Deputy Mark Willis standing there, she felt no alarm. After all, Willis had become a regular visitor. He was always so polite, always so reassuring. He had made her feel safe. On that night, however, the man she had trusted would show his true colors. He told Sophie that he was just checking in, making sure everything was all right while her parents were out. The concern in his voice seemed genuine. He asked if he could come inside, and Sophie, not wanting to be rude to an officer, agreed. It wasn't the first time he had come by when she was home alone. She had no reason to be scared, but the mood in the room suddenly changed. At first, it was just casual conversation, but something shifted. His gaze lingered a bit too long, and his tone took on a softer, more intimate quality. He wasn't the same friendly deputy who had stopped by before. Sophie, sensing that something wasn't right, became uncomfortable, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She tried to steer the conversation back to safe topics, but Mark Willis wasn't listening anymore. He wasn't there to chat. He was there for something far more sinister. Suddenly, the conversation stopped. Willis moved closer, his demeanor changing completely. Sophie's heart raced as he invaded her personal space, her mind trying to make sense of what was happening. His words became more forceful, more controlling. He told her to trust him, that he wouldn't hurt her, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. Before she could react, he grabbed her. His hand was on her arm, and before she knew it, he had pushed her against the wall. Sophie was in a panic, desperately trying to break free from his grip. But Willis was stronger, much stronger. He used his power, his authority, and his physical strength to overpower her. Her voice, once so full of life, was now silenced by fear. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Sophie's world of safety and protection shattered into a million pieces in those terrifying moments. The man she had trusted, the man her family had trusted, was nothing more than a predator hiding behind a badge. He took advantage of her without caring about how scared, hurt, or humiliated she felt. The assault felt endless, and when it was over, Sophie was left alone, her body and spirit broken. When Willis was finished, he stood over her, his uniform still neat, his badge still shining. But the mask had slipped, and Sophie saw him for what he truly was. He warned her not to say anything. He told her that no one would believe her, that if she spoke out, it would only make things worse. He was the deputy, after all. Who would take the word of a scared 16-year-old girl over his? Sophie was frozen in fear. What could she do? Who could she tell? This was a man of the law, someone everyone respected. She believed him when he said no one would believe her. The fear he instilled in her was enough to keep her silent, so she carried the burden alone, with no one to turn to, no one to confide in. Weeks passed, and Sophie tried to bury the memory of that night. She went through her days in a daze, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But something was wrong. She began feeling sick in the mornings, her energy drained. At first, she thought it was the stress of keeping such a terrible secret. But soon, the truth became undeniable. Sophie was pregnant. The realization hit her like a wave of terror. The child she was carrying wasn't the result of love or trust. It was a chilling echo of the horrors she'd been through. She was just a girl, still in high school, full of life and dreams of her future. But here she was, stuck in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The man who had violated her left her with a permanent reminder of his crime. The emotions overwhelmed her. Fear, shame, confusion. What was she going to do? How could she tell her parents? How could she tell anyone? She was too scared to reveal the truth, too terrified of what would happen if she spoke up. Willis's threats still echoed in her mind. If she told anyone, he said, her life would be ruined. No one would believe her. She was trapped, both by the pregnancy and by the fear that controlled her every thought. For Sophie, the pregnancy wasn't just a physical burden, it was a constant reminder of the man who had stolen her innocence. She was haunted by the memory of that night, by the thought of what might happen if anyone found out. The life growing inside her was not the product of love, but of fear, and that fear was now a part of her every day, a shadow that followed her wherever she went. Her family noticed Sophie's growing distance, but they couldn't quite put their finger on why. They would ask her if something was wrong, but every time Sophie would give the same response: "I'm fine." To them, it seemed like the typical mood swings of a teenager, something she would eventually grow out of. As the weeks passed, Sophie's body began to show the strain of her pregnancy. She became increasingly sick, nausea, fatigue, and weight changes that she could no longer hide. Her parents grew more concerned, asking more questions. "Are you all right?" they'd ask. "You don't look well." Sophie, still terrified of exposing the truth, brushed off their concerns, insisting she was fine. But the signs were growing too obvious to ignore. Her parents' worry deepened, and as Sophie became more withdrawn, whispers and rumors started circulating in the small town. Deputy Mark Willis, always vigilant, started hearing these rumors himself. Panic set in as he realized the truth was unraveling. His control over Sophie was slipping, and the consequences of his actions were beginning to loom over him. He knew that Sophie's pregnancy, now noticeable to others, could expose everything. His carefully crafted act was falling apart at the seams, and he would soon face the full weight of his crime. The pregnancy changed everything. It was no longer just Sophie's word against his. The growing life inside her was undeniable proof of what he had done, and if anyone found out, it would be the end for him. The thought of losing everything he had built, his career, his reputation, his freedom, consumed Deputy Mark Willis. But it wasn't just his job on the line. His family's stability and standing in the community were at stake. He had a wife, children, and a life that depended on his image as a respected officer. The idea of his family being torn apart by the revelation of his crime drove him into a spiral of desperation. He couldn't let Sophie's pregnancy expose him, or the truth would destroy everything he held dear. So, Willis took action. He began a campaign of intimidation against Sophie, designed to keep her silent at all costs. It started with subtle reminders of his power, reminders of the badge he wore and the authority he held over her. He told her that no one would believe her, that people would think she had seduced him, or that she was lying for attention. He painted a picture of a world where Sophie would be the one blamed for everything, where she would be the one to suffer if the truth ever came out. "If you say anything, it's your word against mine," he would tell her, his voice cold and threatening. "And who do you think people will believe? A scared little girl or an officer of the law?" Sophie, already fragile from the trauma she had endured, felt her fear grow with each passing day. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way out of this nightmare. But every time she thought about telling someone, her parents, a friend, anyone, Willis's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that speaking up would only make things worse. The intimidation escalated. Willis began following her, keeping a close eye on her movements. She would catch glimpses of his patrol car parked near her house, his presence a constant reminder of the danger she was in. He would show up at places where he knew she would be, at school, at the grocery store, anywhere she went. And though he didn't say anything, his mere presence was enough to terrify her. Willis made sure to remind her that her very life was at stake. "If you tell anyone," he warned, "I'll make sure you regret it. You'll wish you had never opened your mouth." Those words haunted her. Sophie had never felt so alone, so isolated from the people who cared about her. She could no longer confide in her family. She withdrew from her friends, and at school, she avoided everyone. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every day, she carried the secret of her assault, her pregnancy, and the threats from Deputy Mark Willis. Her once vibrant life had been reduced to a series of cautious steps, every move calculated to avoid detection, to keep the truth hidden. But the one thing Sophie couldn't stop was time. Her pregnancy had progressed, and the evidence of the crime Willis had committed was becoming harder and harder to conceal. Willis knew this. He could see the changes in Sophie, the signs that her pregnancy was no longer a secret she could keep. And for him, the fear of being exposed was growing by the day. He knew that if anyone found out, his entire life would be destroyed. His career, his reputation, everything he had built would come crashing down. And so, as the walls closed in on him, Willis became desperate enough to do the unthinkable. It was a quiet night. The streets of Sophie's town were calm, the world around her seemingly peaceful. But inside, Sophie's mind was in turmoil. She had barely slept in weeks, her body exhausted from carrying the physical and emotional weight of the pregnancy. And it was on this quiet night that Willis made his move. Sophie was at home, once again alone, when Willis arrived. He hadn't come to check in this time, nor had he come to intimidate her, as he had done so many times before. No, this time was different. He knew that the only way to protect himself, to bury the truth forever, was to make sure Sophie could never speak out. And so, on that fateful night, Willis lured her into what would become her final, deadly trap. He was calm when he arrived, his voice steady, reassuring, just as it had been the first time he had come to her home. He told her that he needed to talk to her, that there was something important they needed to discuss. Sophie, exhausted and emotionally drained, didn't suspect that this night would be any different from the others. But as he led her outside, away from the safety of her home, the danger became real. What happened next was brutal, calculated, and devastating. Willis, desperate to ensure Sophie could never reveal his secret, attacked her with a level of aggression she never could have imagined. He struck her repeatedly, each blow fueled by his desperation to protect himself, to ensure that his secret would never come to light. Sophie was too weak to fight back, her body crumpling under the weight of his assault. She tried to scream, but no one could hear her. The quiet night, once so peaceful, was now the backdrop to a horrific crime. Willis didn't stop until Sophie lay motionless. He stood over her, breathing heavily, a twisted sense of relief washing over him. The fear of being exposed, of losing everything, had pushed him to this point. In his mind, silencing Sophie had been his only way out. Looking down at her lifeless body, he felt a dark fulfillment. He had erased the one person who could destroy his life. But even in that moment of control, there was no peace, only the grim realization that his actions would haunt him forever. He still had one last thing to do. Sophie's body, broken and beaten, was discarded like trash. Willis, cold and calculating, left her in a remote area, far enough away from her home that it would take time for anyone to find her. He didn't care about the life he had just ended. All he cared about was covering his tracks, making sure that no one would ever connect him to the crime. But it didn't take long for Sophie's family to realize that something was wrong. When her parents returned home that night, they immediately noticed that Sophie wasn't there. Panic set in as they searched the house, calling her name, hoping that she had just gone out for a walk or to meet a friend. But as the minutes passed, the dread in their hearts grew. It was only a matter of time before her body was found. The discovery of Sophie's lifeless body sent shockwaves through the community. She had been brutally beaten, her once beautiful face now unrecognizable, her body left abandoned as if it meant nothing. For Sophie's parents, the discovery was the beginning of an unending nightmare. John and Linda Johnson were devastated, their world shattered in an instant. The daughter they had loved so much, the girl who had brought so much joy to their lives, was gone. And it wasn't just that she was gone, it was the way she had been taken. The violence, the brutality, the sheer cruelty of it all was too much to bear. Linda, in tears, collapsed when she heard the news, her heart broken beyond repair. John, too stunned to speak, could only hold his wife as they wept. As news of Sophie's murder spread, the entire town was engulfed in sorrow. People gathered in the streets, holding candles, placing flowers at the site where her body had been found. It was a cruel end to a young life that had once been so full of promise. Sophie Johnson had been taken far too soon, her dreams cut short by the man who was supposed to protect her. But even in the face of such overwhelming grief, one question remained. Who had done this? Who had taken Sophie's life? The answer, when it finally came, would shock the town to the bone. In the days following the discovery of Sophie Johnson's body, the town was gripped by grief and fear. The police launched a full-scale investigation. At first, they had little to go on. The crime scene where Sophie's body had been found was remote, and any physical evidence had been compromised by the elements. There were no obvious suspects, no immediate leads. Sophie had been a quiet, well-liked girl with no known enemies. As detectives looked closer into Sophie's life, a troubling link to Deputy Mark Willis started to form. Her friends, especially Sarah, noticed how Sophie became increasingly uncomfortable around Willis, who visited her home often under the guise of his duties. Sarah recalled Sophie confiding that Willis made her nervous, though she never explained why. Investigation progressed, and the pressure on Willis mounted. Detectives obtained search warrants and began to piece together a timeline of his actions in the weeks leading up to Sophie's death. Phone records revealed multiple calls between Willis and Sophie, calls that Sophie had kept hidden from her family. His patrol records showed that he had frequently been in the area around Sophie's home, even when he had no official reason to be there. All of these small, seemingly unrelated pieces began to fit together, creating a disturbing portrait of a man who had abused his power to exploit a young girl. Initially, Willis wasn't considered a suspect. He was, after all, a trusted member of the community. He had been one of the first officers on the scene when Sophie's body was discovered, and he had offered his condolences to her grieving family. He played the role of the concerned protector perfectly, his outward demeanor calm and composed. But with the recent discovery, investigators began to notice that something didn't add up. Then there was this critical piece of evidence, Sophie's diary. Hidden away in her bedroom, the diary contained Sophie's most private thoughts, including her fears about Willis. In heartbreaking detail, she wrote about how he had forced himself on her and into her life, how she felt trapped and unable to escape his control. She wrote about the threats he had made to keep her silent, about the fear she lived with every day. The diary was the missing link, proof that Willis had not only been involved in Sophie's life, but that he had been the one who terrorized her in the months before her death. With this new evidence in hand, investigators began to close in on Willis. The final piece of the puzzle came when they interviewed one of Willis's fellow officers, who revealed that Willis had been acting strangely in the days following Sophie's murder. He had been unusually nervous, asking odd questions about the investigation and whether the police had found any hard evidence. This behavior, coupled with the mounting circumstantial evidence, gave investigators enough to move forward. The arrest came as a shock to the entire community. The truth of his actions left everyone questioning how they could have been so blind. People who had once waved at him on the street now looked at him with horror. The man they had trusted, the man who had worn the badge with pride, was nothing more than a predator in disguise. For Sophie's family, the arrest brought a sense of relief, but it could never undo the damage that had been done. Their daughter was gone, her life stolen by a man who had deceived them all. The justice system would take its course, but no sentence could ever bring Sophie back. As the investigation concluded and the evidence against Willis continued to pile up, one thing became clear. This was not a crime of passion. This was a crime of control, of manipulation, and of power. Willis had used every tool at his disposal to ensure that Sophie's life ended on his terms. But in the end, it was his own arrogance and his belief that he was untouchable that led to his downfall. The community would never be the same, forever haunted by the knowledge that the person they had trusted the most was capable of the unthinkable. The trial of Deputy Mark Willis was one of the most anticipated and emotional events the town had ever seen. For months, the community had been gripped by the horrific details of Sophie Johnson's murder, and now, the man responsible for taking her life was finally being brought to justice. Sophie's family sat in the front row every day, their faces etched with grief and anger. They listened as the details of their daughter's suffering were laid bare for the court to hear. Her mother, Linda, wept quietly as Sophie's diary was read aloud, each word a reminder of the terror her daughter had lived with. Her father, John, remained stoic, his eyes fixed on the man who had taken everything from him. It was a pain no parent should ever have to endure, watching the person who had murdered their child face justice, knowing that no verdict could ever bring their daughter back. When the moment arrived for the jury to announce their verdict, a heavy silence filled the courtroom. The judge read the charges: rape, murder, and abuse of power. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Mark Willis, the man who had once worn the badge of law enforcement, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the town began to heal, the community struggled to come to terms with the betrayal they had experienced. Sophie's story became a symbol of the devastating consequences of betrayal and abuse of power. It was a reminder that the people we trust with our safety can sometimes be the very ones who harm us. The impact of Willis's actions went far beyond the courtroom. It affected everyone who had known Sophie, everyone who had believed in the goodness of their community. It was a heartbreak that would take years to heal, if it ever truly could. For Sophie's family, the grief never faded. Her mother, Linda, kept Sophie's room just as it had been the day she disappeared, her books still on the desk, her bed neatly made, as if she might walk in at any moment. Her father, John, would sit in the room for hours, staring at the framed photos of his daughter, remembering the girl she had been before her life was cruelly taken. They lived each day with the weight of her absence, knowing that their world would never be whole again. For many in the community, the trial and sentencing brought closure, but the deeper wounds, the ones caused by betrayal, remained. The town now carried the weight of the knowledge that evil can hide behind even the most trusted faces, and that justice, while served in the courtroom, can never undo the suffering of a family shattered by loss. Sophie's story is not just about the crime itself, but about the broader implications of what happens when power is abused. It's a sobering reminder of the fragility of trust and the ease with which it can be exploited. The aftermath of this case will forever echo in the hearts of those who knew Sophie, and her tragic end will remain a symbol of the consequences of unchecked power and the devastating impact it can have on innocent lives. Thank you for watching this heartbreaking story of Sophie Johnson. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, please consider supporting causes that advocate for justice for victims of abuse, power, and violence. Let Sophie's story remind us to stay vigilant, to hold those in positions of power accountable, and to never turn a blind eye to those who need protection. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe to True Crime Tapes to hear more real-life stories of crime and justice. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Together we can shed light on the stories that matter and honor the lives of those who were taken too soon.